course introduction. So, I just want to give you a brief introduction to what decision modelling is, and of course this has all been pre-recorded anyway, so you can catch up on that. So a little bit about what the course objectives are, the activities and the issues and topics we're going to cover, a little bit about the teaching and learning methods that we're going to use. I will sometimes assign some pre-learning that I will hope will be done before you come to the class, because if you are pre-warned and ready to be able to work through, we can get more out of what we do in the class because we're able to do it in the laboratory. I'll be running workshops on the number of weeks which I've got in the course outline, which will be on Fridays, where you can come and work with me and the laboratory assistant to help work through the exercises and catch up on bits that you haven't been able to master yourself, either from the lectures or from the learning materials that I put up. We'll have that opportunity to work through that. I'll also discuss with you the assessment and how that's going to work and the resources that I'm using. So what is decision modelling? Anyone have any ideas? Well, people who did the introduction will know, won't you? So managerial decision making. Decision making is arguably the most important thing that managers do. As I understand it, the number of decisions that a manager makes increases in terms of the number of activities that they have to control, and the higher up the organisation's management structure one goes, the more important the decisions are at the big level, the more strategic decisions. So there may be fewer of them, but they're very, very critical decisions. Down, as we feed down into the operational level, there may be many more individual small decisions to be made, and they may have lower value, but they've got to be integrated across with everything that happens in the organisation. Otherwise, you'll end up with inconsistent decisions being made that don't feed through into the achievement of the organisation's strategy. But it's one of the easiest things to get wrong. Have any of you read anything of Kahneman and Tversky's decision traps? The psychology of decision making, type 1 and type 2 thinking decisions. As humans, our brains are wired as if we lived in the jungle still. And we have a lot of what we call heuristics that we've sort of inherited along with our DNA. And those are the things that lead us to make quick snap decisions, judgments, really quickly, because we haven't got time to process through all of the thinking. And it's the sort of things we had to do when, out of the corner of the eye, we spotted the lion in the jungle, so we had to make a quick decision to get out of there. As life has become very much different to living in the jungle, we've now realised that some of the decisions we have to make involve much more things that aren't life or death decisions, but are perhaps really big value decisions. Some of those things that senior executives in firms have to make, the big value decisions. Now, those have high stakes associated with them. They may not be life or death, but there's huge stakes associated with them. And for those, we need to override our snap judgments, because sometimes our snap judgments that wire us for survival aren't necessarily the best things to guide us for making decisions when we've got these more complex situations that we're making decisions about. And that's where we need to engage what Kahneman and Tversky call type 2 thinking, which is where you don't make rushed snap judgments. You step back and think through the dimensions of the problem, start coming to grips with the complexity. And this is where we start forming models of thinking about the things that are going into that decision, where we start thinking clearly about what our options are. In the lion case, we have two options: stay and get eaten, or go and maybe survive. But in real life, we don't just have two options, we often have many options. So we need to have ways of thinking systematically through the options we have available before we choose which method we're going to use even to come to a decision, and then out of the methods we're going to use, which options we're going to now consider as on the table or available for us to choose from, and then from amongst them selecting which one we're going to take. So this is where decision making needs training. You can't just rely on those snap judgments. You need to have the skills of how you think through these decision situations to help you get a more reasoned approach, because arguably this is how you're going to get to better decisions being made by managers. So it's one we're least trained for, but the good news is it's a skill that can be learned. And if developed and honed, you can make better decisions and you can use it effectively. One of the good things is yes, it can be learned. Another thing that I have found as well is you have to keep practicing some of these skills to keep them honed. It's a bit like athletics. You know, if you let your body slip, then your decision of making ability slips a bit. So you have to keep keeping this stuff fresh if you're going to do it. Now, it's great if you're a manager and you're doing these things every day, you'll keep it fresh. It's a little bit difficult for you as students because I think well, you've all done Quant 102 or something equivalent. Who did it 2 years ago? Who did it 3 years ago? More than 3 years ago? Right. Have any of you who did it more than 2 years ago used a lot of maths in the meantime? Well, unfortunately, maths is one of those things that feed into this and they can go a bit rusty. So we're going to use this opportunity to create examples which you can work through to reactivate those skills, bring them back up into the top of your mind again, and blend them with the tools and techniques, that the processes that manage decision making, so that we can make better decisions. Now, with this course, as I said, good solution, but you have to know you've got the right problem. There's decision making is both a skill and an art. There's some art bits in there as well, because you have to know how to carefully analyse the situation you're working in. You have to know what your problem actually is. And this is where, having studied a whole lot in other areas of management, is very important, because that helps you understand what problems you're actually trying to solve. Are you trying to solve an HR problem of which people to assign to which tasks to get the jobs done most efficiently? Are you looking at a budgeting problem? Are you looking at a decision on deciding how much of the ingredients X, Y, and Z you're going to be putting into the hopper to make the outputs? You need to know that stuff that comes from your management learning. So what we're going to be doing in this course is thinking about what problems we're endeavouring to solve with the tools and techniques I'm going to share with you. But there's never usually one solution to these things, because the context matters. What might be the right way to think about something in one situation may not be the right way of thinking about it in another. And in a few weeks' time, we'll look at things about how decision makers' risk propensities affect what the right way to make a decision is. So two managers in two different firms facing different risk scenarios can have exactly the same data. Each may come up with a completely different decision, because the decision they're making is for them, given their scenarios, their environment, their context, their industry, which may be different to someone else facing exactly the same apparent numbers, but working in a different industry where things are different. So you're going to need to bring both your managerial learning and a little bit of your other maths and decision-making learning to come to this course, to bring the two things together. Now, I'm adding a last exploratory lecture to this course this year, where I'm going to look at things like artificial intelligence and decision learning and things on computer systems, because I've made my career as an academic by looking largely at other people's models and working out where the problems are. And none of the problems have been because of the skill or talent with which the person running the software has executed it. It's usually been because there's something in the way the problem has been set up that the person making the decision hasn't acknowledged. And that's why you can't just look at the technical solution. You've got to be able to understand the context in which the decision is being made in. So to that end, for those of you who might not actually be crash hot mathematicians in the first place, fine, there's going to be stuff in this course for you. What I hope you're going to get out of this is that you're going to learn some of the questions you're going to have to ask those people on the keys to help you understand what you can take out of what they've done when you apply it to your decision context. That we shouldn't just be driven by this stuff because the computer says X. We have to know a little bit about why the computer says X. And we also need to know whether the computer's telling us X is actually relevant for our industry, because those generic models, you have to understand how the generic model has been built up to be able to understand if it works for your industry or not. And that's as much about the context as it is about the actual numbers that go on within it. So that's why I say decision making is an art and a science, and there's a lot of experience in it. You need to know a fair bit about your own context. So as managers, you learn that as you work in your industries, and you can bring that judgment to someone else's number crunching. Or if you really love the number crunching, then hopefully that's great because you can do the numbers well. But it also means that as a number cruncher, you have a responsibility to understand what the manager's problem really is, because otherwise you'll end up in this situation where you have a great solution, but it wasn't really for the problem the manager was wanting to solve. So those things really matter. So typically decision making is being treated as an event, a one-off thing in isolation, where people have, when we say advocacy versus inquiry, you have to check. Have people already decided what answer they want, and they're simply looking for evidence to back up the answer they want? Or is this really an open-minded inquiry looking at all of those options? We have politicians across the road. I have a number of good friends and former students who work in places across the road, Mount Molesworth Street and whatever, and a number of them come to me when we have coffee and say, it's really depressing when I have to go to the minister and say, we have these options, this is the bad one, this is the even worse one, and this is the worst possible one you can possibly make, because I can't actually tell them to do the thing that I think is really going to be best, because that's not in the options they want to consider. I want you in this course to have an open mind and think about all of those options, because part of that advice is, as Sir Humphrey says in Yes Minister, sometimes you might have to tell the minister that bad, worse, or even better, but maybe you also have to say, but there is this other alternative, and if you're going to exclude this, you need to be aware that in turning this down, you might have to face some criticism of people who think you should do that. So this is what my frame, my model tells me that I think is the really good reasons why it should be adopted. If you're not going to choose that one, you better come up with some really good reasons why not. So that's where we have to be careful there with what we're doing. As decision makers, we're looking for advocacy versus inquiry. The way in which we carry out the management of the implementation of the decision once made is outside the scope of this course. That's where you take HR and strategy and OB and all of those things to do that. But in this course, we want to keep an open mind and see what all of those options are on the table. Quite often there's lack of structure in the debate that goes on. So people want an instant answer to something, but they haven't actually stepped back and thought about some of the ramifications that go on. How many of you have done 206? Most of you should have. So you've done the theory of constraints and got the issues there of thinking about evaporating clouds and realising that there's often many things on the table to be thought about. And if you don't have a structure in thinking through how the problem works, you may decide something can't be resolved. Whereas with some thinking and the application of a model like evaporating cloud, you can put some structure over it and come to a decision that is better than the one you would have had otherwise. So that's why a lot of decision making is characterised by lack of structure. In this course, we're going to learn some tools and tricks which will help us put some structure around that to help us. You've encountered that already in 206. We're extending on that same concept again. We get conflict, which of course you've learned about in 206. You can have haphazard approaches. where people just do that gut reaction or just do what they want to. That decision making is not helpful if you've not considered other options on the table. And it can often take a lot of time to reach closure, even when you've got some decision processes there. So typical decision making can be quite problematic, but if we apply some of these tools, we can take away some of that mystery, so that even though we mightn't agree fully with or like the recommendations we have to make, we've got a way of saying, well, this is what the model says, given these assumptions we ought to do. I found that really good in my experience, because the model allows you to distance yourself from the emotion that can get involved with decision making. As you've seen with evaporating cloud. Evaporating cloud gives you a way to explain how two different points of view can be looked at within a single problem. Well, if you've got different frameworks, you can also step back like that and say, well, this is what the data arranged and processed through this model tell us would be the best thing to do. So it's the data and the model telling the story, not you personally. And particularly when there are complex and emotive things involved, being able to use the models that way can be very helpful. I'm playing around at the moment with some ideas for the future parts of the course where we can look at some scenarios and decisions around the COVID management decisions that have been made, because they've been some examples, I think, of some of these problems with decision making that would have possibly led to different outcomes if different tools and techniques have been used. We realise at the moment that, if I go back to that other slide, there's a bit of advocacy going on with some of them, some lack of structure in some of them, some haphazard decisions being made, quick decisions being made without time to reflect, and we can see some of the consequences. Now, whether or not there was time is out of the question here, but we can use some of these models to think about what alternatives there would have been had there been more time to think about it. So that shows where some of the benefits are in using these models and frameworks rather than the gut reaction. So problem solving and decision making are different things. They're not always, while they might be heading towards the same end, you may have a set of problems or frames that you can look at a problem with, which, this problem solving technique might get you to that answer, but this problem solving technique might get you to a different answer. You now have to think, well, I've got a decision to make. This one says I do A, this one says I do B. I've now got to weigh up which one is best in the circumstances I've got. And that's where it comes into decision making, because you're not always going to have a no-brainer answer. You might have to evaluate different ways of thinking about the problem before coming to a conclusion about which one you're going to do. Or you could even get situations like with theory of constraints. If you think about the problem from a different position, if you've got these two possibly intractable solutions and intractable problem techniques used, maybe evaporating cloud can get you to realise that there's a third or fourth possible solution that we hadn't considered otherwise. So now you can see that just because you can solve a problem doesn't mean you can make the right decision. So those two things work separately. So what are we going to think about in this course? We're going to think about decision making as a process. It's going to have some steps that we go through. We're going to have multiple alternatives. There is never a situation where there is only one alternative. If we do think we've got that, then we truly are in that type 1 jungle situation where the only alternative is to run because the lion is there. I've encountered very few situations in managerial decision making that are like that. Almost always managers have time to think about things. And that's why there are always multiple alternatives. It's It's just sometimes we might have to think carefully within the context we're working in to work out what they are. We're going to realise that we don't always have all the information we need, because that's just reality. Sometimes we have to make assumptions. Now we're going to be building models. Models are simplifications or abstractions back from complex scenarios where we pull out variables that we think matter. We make assumptions about how they're related, and then we go ahead and we solve our problems with the data, but then we have to think, were the assumptions we made credible? How believable were they? What if, instead of this, we just tweaked it a bit and had this and a bit? Would that change, first of all, the solution to the problem, but second, what does that do to my decision that I make? So we have to be aware of what assumptions we've made, and these can be assumptions not just about the data, but they can also be about assumptions of which was the appropriate decision method to use when we're thinking about this. So we make assumptions, so we need to know as best we can what our assumptions are, because those assumptions can be the things that lead to the difference between what happens in the model and what happens in the real world, particularly when we're working on models that are forecasting something in the future. So we need to test the assumptions, kick the tyres of what we've done and see whether it really does stand up when we kick the tyres or whether the machine falls over. But in order to do this, we need to have some well-defined criteria, and we need to be explicit about what these are, and we need to communicate that, because that's what allows people to critique what we've done. We do the best we can with the information we have available and our own skills. But that need not be the be-all and the end-all, because quite often decisions are made in teams. Or, as an academic, when I create models and write papers about them, I immediately open it up, and then all of my peers have the opportunity to look at my model and kick the tyres and try and find out where it went wrong. And that's good, because when people kick the tyres and it goes wrong, then it means we can improve what we've done and make it better. So that's positive for making a better decision, but it's also positive for getting different and better ways of making the models as well. So we want, dissent and debate is inevitable, but if we've got a well-specified problem, good criteria, we've articulated it well, we're clear and understand ourselves how we got there, then first of all, it's easier for us to defend what we've done. Second, it's easier for other people to have a look at it and critique it and find a problem if there is one. But it also means that if they look at it and can't find a problem, then it reinforces what you've done has been a sound process for making that decision. So dissent and debate is to be welcomed, because it helps us make better decisions. And also we have to take account of things like fairness. We'll do a lot of decision modelling in this course that looks for quantitative answers. But sometimes those quantitative answers do have real problems associated with them because of people's perceptions of what is a fair process as opposed to what is a robust decision-making process. So we need to be clear of those distinctions. So fairness is a value that we have to recognise people have, and we have to think about that when we are making these decision recommendations. It often comes up when one's working in a policy area, because decisions that policymakers have to make sometimes have to factor in some different things. But even in business and industry, we find that fairness matters to an extent. In the debates going on about whether Facebook is a mean, ugly giant monopolising the advertising industry, or whether it's just a fair-facing competition from a small number of other providers, still have meaning for a number of businesses which are now currently conducting a boycott of their advertising on Facebook. There's a whole lot of mixed reasons why they're doing it, but one of them is these firms have made decisions based on sometimes what they think is fairness. Is it fair to support a firm who may be ascribing to some ways of doing things that we don't agree with, even though that's right for Facebook? So fairness has to be considered as well. So with many of these decisions, in reality, in business, you often make these decisions in teams. And it's great that you do it in teams because diversity in council can be good in helping you explore these things. Ultimately, though, the key decision maker has to make a decision because you can't faff around forever just thinking about it. You've sometimes got to do something, and someone's got to make a decision, and ultimately that ends up being the CEO or the top person or the person responsible for that. As we hear in politics, we talk about prime ministers, captains' calls and things. Someone has to make a decision, but with that comes accountability for what you're doing. So diversity in council, unity in command is what Cyrus the Great recommended. And I think if we can see how our input into that decision-making process works at whatever point we are in it, I think that's helpful to recognise that sometimes you make recommendations that are ignored. Other things take, but sometimes you just have to know why. So, is doing nothing an option? A lot of decisions are made by not making a decision. How many times have you seen some crisis arises, everyone sort of gets around the table and we have jawboning for long periods of time. Everyone talks about a whole bunch of things. Maybe someone thinks, maybe we should do this, but the meeting evaporates, goes away, no one's actually made a decision, and nothing happens. Well, sometimes doing nothing is the right thing. But in this course, doing nothing is the right thing when it's the result of a principled decision-making process. Every time we make a decision, there's always the option of doing nothing. Consider what would happen if you do nothing. So it means there is never a no-brainer decision to be made. There's always the decision to be made versus do nothing. And if you evaluate that against do nothing, if do nothing is the outcome of a principled decision-making process, then you know that doing nothing is the right thing to do, and doing nothing is not an abdication of decision-making responsibility, but a constructive decision in its own right. And you will know why it's the right thing to do because you've gone through the process to evaluate it. You'll be able to explain clearly and succinctly why doing nothing is the right thing. And if you do that with that managerial emphasis and you're confident when you've evaluated it with your assumptions being tested and your tyres being kicked, then you'll know why the other options are not good ones to take. So doing nothing is the right thing, not because something magical happens, it's because someone's made a good decision. So that's what we're going to cover in the principles of the course, the structure of it. The learning objectives we've got there is to develop robust solutions through decision modelling, identify key elements, situations, demonstrate the knowledge of various frameworks, application to real problems, critical thinking and communication skills. Leader, all those things that you can read in those learning objectives we've got. Vicky, that's interesting. Vicky very kindly created this as a prerequisites tree on meeting all of those. I won't go into that, but it's a nice way of looking at it. But remembering the big picture, we're going to explore a range of decision modelling approaches to support decision making in common situations. We're going to develop and use spreadsheet models, the reasons why we'll talk about shortly, in the context of managing businesses and policy operations and services. So recognising that we live in Wellington and a lot of our graduates go across the road to public service. It's not just about business decisions, we look at policy decisions as well. And we're going to use the systems thinking decision-making approach that we've developed with you through 206. If you've done it, or for those who are doing 208, you're seeing that coming through in that. So this is where this leads to our approach to teaching these things in a systems thinking decision-making context. It's a hands-on course. You will learn by doing. It's a little bit unfortunate that sometimes you will have to get your hands dirty on the spreadsheets. That's why we're having the classes in the computer laboratory. I know some of you will find it a lot easier to use the spreadsheet modelling than others. That's okay. If you are having troubles with it, please let us know. We're here to help. I want to guide you through that. So with the things that we do in the course, I want you by the end of the course to be confident in using the spreadsheets that we develop for these solutions. If you can master that, you will be 1,000% ahead of most people who haven't done this course when they move into management. And the reality is, businesses everywhere use spreadsheets for an awful lot of things. So being comfortable with this, even if you're not punching the numbers yourself, being confident enough to be able to ask the right questions of the people who have done it can be very helpful to stop you falling into a rabbit hole. So, as I said, we're going to work through the examples together in class. So I will have a pattern in the teaching where we introduce the model. I'll take you through it with some teaching example, which we'll work through in class. I will give you some learning cases, which I encourage you to work through first on your own outside class, and then those will be the focus of what we do in the laboratory, so we can work through the learning cases together. And then we will have assessment cases where the assessment that comes with each module will just be an application of the things that we've learned with the teaching cases and the learning cases. So there's no surprises in the assessment. It will simply be the use of those models in a slightly different decision context. So I'm going to give you lots of opportunities. You can come to the tutorials to practice, or the laboratories to practice the learning cases. If you wish, I've got space available in Blackboard, which if you go and have a look at it, I'm not sure, I'm reluctant to switch this too much because I don't want to disadvantage the people who are watching on Zoom. But in Blackboard, if you have a look in the laboratory resources or the tutorial resources, you will find I've allowed spaces there for each of the learning cases to allow you to upload your spreadsheets, and I can give you feedback and comments on whether you got it right or wrong, whether you're on target or not. If you've got questions about that, then you've got the opportunity to ask me about it. So I want to be able to give you as much feedback as I possibly can so that there's no surprises here, to give you that help and support. If you're really confident and you don't feel you need any feedback on it, you don't have to upload it. No one has to take advantage of that, but I've given you that opportunity, and I've put it like an assessment because it does allow me to be able to give full comments to you back when I've looked at what you've done to help you individually on where you might want to look at something or to help you within that. Now, I do have, and I can't do it here, I will have times available as well where you can drop in and come and see me. I've set aside 10 to 12 on Fridays as a drop-in, principally for 208, which I'm also teaching, but I gather from Vicky, who did 206 last semester, she had 2 hours a week and practically no one from 206 dropped in. So if you guys want to drop in during that time as well, either physically in RH929 or via Zoom, I'll let you have the Zoom meeting. You can drop in then and we can catch it that way, because I'm hoping that, like Vicky found in 206, we won't have too many people there. So I'll be available that time if you wish to drop in. But in the weeks when we don't have tutorials ourselves, which is this week, and I can't remember which others, but I'll still be there at the time where we would have had the labs. I'll be in my office. So if you did want to drop in at those times, you can come in. So those are the topics. This week and next week, we're going to do a bit about data presentation and introduction to spreadsheet modelling. Weeks 3 to 5, we're going to do forecasting. Weeks 6 to 8, we're going to do decision analysis and risk management. Weeks 9 to 11, simulation. And the new lecture for me for this year is this looking ahead with the role of big data, artificial intelligence and machine learning. That's going to be fun. I'm hoping I may be able to inveigle my partner in crime and a whole bunch of other things to also help me on that. He works extensively in the area of AI and big data. But maybe we can pull together a podcast or something around that we can share with that. He's done a lot of work using AI in the banking sector. Unfortunately, he's in South Africa, stuck there for the duration, and I'm here, so it would have to be a podcast, but I'll see what we can do about that. Otherwise, I'll just plod on through with what I've learned in that. But it's a way of just sort of putting some blue skies out there and thinking about what some of the challenges are to the discipline going forward. So, the teaching and learning. Prepare. I will give you the materials in advance. Please feel free to have a look at them. I really encourage you to do that. It would be really good if you could just be familiar with the teaching cases that I'm using, and if you're using your own machines in class, download them and have them ready to go. Have a go at playing around with them if you wish. Just get ready for it so that when we're working through them in class, you are familiar a little bit with what we might be doing. The classes in the laboratory we're going to work through together. This is where we can help each other. I can help you, you can help each other. We've got Warren, the lab assistant, who'll be there to help us too. As I said, the teaching and learning examples lead directly to the assessment cases. So if you work through those successively, you will develop all the skills you need to be able to do the assessment.